So, hey, all good morning. I hope you have all the coffee in your hand like me here. So then let's start. So short to me myself, I am the CEO of QESTIT, and I'm now since 20 plus years in the testing business in one or the other way. And I'm still CEO on the ground. That means that I'm still working in projects and helping out in one or the other situation. So let's now come to the story balancing budget quality with strategic test case management. Well, there are a few lessons learned out of this, but before we come to this, let me give you some insights. It is important that we have an understanding about some basics before we speak about savings or if we speak about costs. We need to be all clear. Any kind of saving or any kind of budget oriented test case approach is always based on the system landscape and the complexity of the system. So it differs from time to time. There is not a one fits it all solution. So that's something we need to be fairly clear on. And it followed also the development methodology. It differs if it's agile or if it's waterfall or mixed out of this. So also here, this is a dependency on it. And the majority of the organization, if you speak about, especially about cost savings, and you have a very mature test organization, then the savings are different if you have just an organization which is in the middle of a change, transformation from old methodology into agile and are hit by whatever kind of activities. There are also no cost savings and no cost optimizations if it's not transparent. So we need to be clear. So today we speak about things where we have an issue or we see how efficiency is actually optimized, how costs are optimized, but there is a necessary level for it. You need to have transparency on it because no transparency, no savings, no improvements. And saving on is also important on the labor costs. You know, if you have everything already offshored, there the labor costs are around 250 euros or Swiss compared to on-site costs. That makes a difference on any kind of saving or any kind of improvement you want to show up. Test stages, level approach of automation, and the environment and test data. So these are all factors basically in the background. So let's come to what we see today or what we want to speak about today. What is in scope is software tests of complex IT systems based on functional tests on different stages, which are performed internal and test on-site resources. Why this and not low-risk application or systems? Sometimes you see the situation that some clients just put software online, especially web services or web-based services or whatever they are called, then the easiest way to save cost is definitely not to do testing, at least in the beginning. Later on, if quality issues come along, then we have costs. But now we want to speak about cost savings, and the low-risk application is a different game, so they are out of scope. Whatever you hear today is not for these low-risk applications or standalone applications where finally we have no complexity in it or no need for testing. Here we can go into it in the next webinar, but not today. So the idea today is to show you up actually cost implications on testing versus budget, and what can be done to optimize actually testing either based on an existing budget or in these days where nearly all organizations have professional testing, how to save costs. Okay. Who is now the right audience? What I will show and what is most probably not so much in the focus. So all those who search some ideas to save costs are obviously welcome here. All those who have some responsibility around value stream, product owners, project managers, test managers, all those, there they have budget under their control and search some cost saving ideas, then this could be a good session to work through together. What is most probably a little bit less the case today, I will not go into the technical details, how to go actually for a method-based testing approach. For example, we have a methodology called linear Q, which is based on a method-based testing approach, linear expansion. Here we will not go into too much details. This can be done later on in the next session, and there go for a webinar to show this in detail how we do this, if there is an interest on it. All right, cost savings overview. Look, finally, in the whole testing field, in our view, there are 9 areas of savings, but with different impacts. We have the strategic guidelines for testing approach. So it's agile, hybrid, or alignment, test process, test stages, templates, all together, which has to do with the processes, procedures. We have organization, project setup, roles, on-site, off-site testing models, risk-based top-down regression concept, industrial models, linear expansion, all that which is around methodology is definitely one of the topics today. We have the supporting processes, defect management, test automation, environment, test government, reporting KPI tools, tool chain, classic, agile, or hybrid. You know, now, to go straightforward, there are 4 areas where you see cost savings, real cost savings, and there are others where you see low cost savings. Here, the 4 marked boxes here, strategic guidelines for testing. This is an important part where we see today some savings. We will see it on the next page. And also where, compared to the savings, we see also a kind of indication, what are the investments? Not all savings just come by nothing. Some of the savings will definitely come with investments, and the investments are sometimes high and sometimes lower. It's important also to speak shortly about this, that we do not have the wrong assumption, go through a webinar, have an idea and implement it without no costs. No, usually there are costs behind it. I'll come to it on the next page. So then the risk-based topic, test automation, organization. In all the gray marked areas, you see actually we have lower savings. Here you see now in the red marked boxes, what kind of savings we do see based on our experience and a summary of lots of projects. Here, strategic guidelines. Currently, we consider actually there are 5 to 10% savings if you set up the strategic guidelines. If you have an approach in the beginning, when you start testing, you define exactly what is definition of done. You actually train the team, you have standardized tools in place, you report in a standardized mode so that you have some stage later on. Transparency about the completion ratio, about the quality of the different teams before you start, for example, overall testing. 5 to 10%, a very low investment. Basically, it's more about setting up the standard, going into the HR teams, meeting the HR teams, convince them. So here the investment is really low. On a method-based approach as well. So here we see conservative thought savings around 20 to 30%. If we optimize the test case portfolios, while we have fairly low investments. It's a method-based approach. We don't need tools. There are low investments to consider. If we have organization, project setup, especially on offsite testings, here we see 20 to 30% saving, especially if you consider today a situation where you have on-site teams and you want to move them step by step into off-site testing mode. Here, we need to be careful that we consider testing works a little bit different than development, what works out and what not. So, but also this is extremely low investment, but the trend goes definitely in direction to offshore, and here are savings in it, out of doubt. And then test automation. Here there are very high savings, but also high investments. The savings are depending actually on the actual situation, the level of automation or no automation, and the way how things are automated, and especially also where they are automated. Do we have a shift left approach where we have especially the HR team, software close test automation, or if we are automating end-to-end testing, it differs tremendous, first of all on the investment and also on the savings. So all the others are either with no savings or the opposite. For example, if you have test environments and you want to improve, there are definitely no real savings directly. It leads always to extra costs. like test governance, reporting KPI. In the long end, for others, there may be savings, but not from a test perspective and the test responsibility. Supporting process is fairly low, test process, test stages, templates fairly low, and tools, tool chains can be 5 to 10%, but also with high investments. So that gives us the first overview about budget implication. And now we go to the question here, the topic risk-based top-down regression concept, industrial models and linear expansions or the method-based testing. You're still here? Or has everybody disappeared? So why do we testing? It's clear. We want to avoid risks. But then let's also start to test the real risks. One of the real observation we see nearly in every client is that they have some risk-based approach, but not really one. They have priorities and say we have priority 1, 2, 3. It's not bad, but they have not a clear consideration where is the real risk of a functionality of an application, of a process, of a system, and balance the number of test cases based on the real risk. So it doesn't make sense to test something which is really peanuts with lots of test cases. But unfortunately, this is often the situation we meet. Now, if you speak about budget and testing, method-based testing, portfolios, then we need to consider two different things. We have, first of all, a greenfield approach where we establish the testing. That means finally we say on the functional enhancements, how do we do testing there? What's the approach to go into a sensible and smart testing to minimize the costs, which is risk-based or method-based. Or we speak about the regression testing. And we have the other side, we have the optimized existing test systems, where we have as well the functional enhancement, especially the regression tests. And here today, we see a few observations. These are real examples. So we have taken over in the automotive field 22,000 test cases and could reduce them by 35%. We are working on a deal where we have currently 45,000 test cases and expectation is to reduce it by 50%. This is a real example. I have been working on me myself. We reduced in an insurance company 14,000 automated test cases to 9,000 to 7,000 without any quality implication. This is important to understand, without quality implication. I mean, the easiest way to reduce costs is always to throw out a lot of test cases, say every second I throw out, but this is no smart way. So finally, it is how can we optimize a system without harming the quality and still assuring that the risk, the real risks are covered and we are focused in the testing on the real risk. This is what we here speak about. On the finance side, we had also an issue where we had 5,000 test cases and we reduced it to 3,500 test cases. And while we did so, we could optimize the functional coverage rate. We will speak about functional coverage rate a little bit later on, from 23% about seriously above 35%. So finally, that means we have less test cases, but in the same time, we have a better coverage of the risk. This should be the target. Finance, we had 5,000 test cases. Now with the story to improve this, think the coverage rate from 30 to 50%. Here it is less about reducing the test cases, it's much more about optimizing. So if you have these numbers now on the table, what is the story about it? Now in a greenfield approach, we could also speak about test case and methodology. Let's do this later on. Let's go straight to the point and see how we could optimize and learn from this, because the mechanics, the methodology, and the way to go for it is the same if you start greenfield or if you have an existing regression test portfolio and you reduce it. The methodology behind it is the same. But it's much easier to explain it if you have a cost reductions example, because then we have results on the table and can prove that actually the methodology and the way we go forward works. Now, what is the approach behind this? there's actually a following report. If you go to the left, we see actually risk-based testing. We do follow the same risk-based testing as everybody. And the recommendation is also make it as simple as possible. You know, there is a Weber-Fechner approach where finally you have with a special way how you actually come to risk evaluation with an exponential formula with 2 dot n high n multiplied with 2 high m. So that means finally we have probability on one hand and damage, and then we make a calculation where we evaluate 1 to 5 risk. 5 is high, low is 1, and then you multiply this and you get the number between finally 2 and 1024. Why this? This is the methodology which has been used by Tosca or Tricentis. So that gives us a spread around 4 to 1024, which is a factor of 250 plus minus. So that's a risk evaluation showing that the high risk are really much higher than the low risk. But finally, key here is that you have an evaluation of the risk can also be 1 to 4, can be an easy approach, but evaluate it and follow it. That's the story here. Okay. If you have a risk-based portfolio, you want to build it up, then before you start, you need to go a step higher. It is not just about the testing. You need first also consider, is it worth to have an overall structure, systematics of the risks of the company and break them down to the individual application or system where you're responsible or you have in your hand. Now, to be very precisely and concrete, if you are in a project responsible for now testing something or in an agile team in an agile mode to test there or build up test cases, then it doesn't make sense to build up an overall risk structure top down, where you have finally the business dimensions, you break them down to the individual departments, you break them down to the processes, to the systems, to the products, and then finally to the test cases. But if, for example, in a company you have an overall view, what we met latest in an insurance company, they had life and non-life insurance together, and they wanted to have a regression test set reflecting the real risks of the company. So then it makes sense to have an overall view and start high level, evaluate the risks of the company, and break them down step by step down to the test cases. There is a heritage, of course, from the overall risk. Now, to be very precisely, let's go to a concrete example. This is a client example. So you have now in the middle, you have the systematics, you have the areas, the business entities, you have the product, the processes, and the systems, and finally, here epics, and then the test cases. Now, if you see that the company earns the money with non-life insurance and not with life insurance, it makes sense to have more focus in testing to the non-life insurance than to the life insurance. If you break down the number section and go directly into, now you see it's German, so translated, it's car. You go to the car business, the numbers here are virtual numbers, artificial numbers, and you, for example, realize that the whole business here is concentrated on car. Then you need also to focus the regression testing on car, because there obviously the real risk, that's the area where the company earns the money. Then you have the products. We have later on some presentation or some slide where you see it may differ from product to product, how much business you make with a product, how much transactions you have. So that needs to be evaluated. Doesn't make sense. Now we see such coverage graph. Finally, we see here the products from left to right. We see here the processes in a matrix. So those who are red are with high priority. Here you see priority goes down, and here we have low priority. Now this is a set of risk evaluation where we have 1 to 4 measures and not 1 to 5. And here you see the products. So there are approximately 8 products out of 23 or 24. And here they actually have 85 to 90% of business in. And all the others are real peanuts products. So you see now green where we have test cases. It's definitely not an optimized portfolio. The coverage rate here was about 23%, and here was the task to build up now a matrix which is finally going direction to 30+% of the coverage. Coverage is always a risk-based coverage. Okay. Now, if we go back now to what we discussed here, starting on top level, if it's an overall system we have in place, it's an overall view, start on the business areas, go down to the product, go down to the processes, because, for example, the selling process, order to cash is most probably more important than a marketing process. Consider systems, and then we are down here to the epics and the test cases. In case now you are in a project world, here the start is the epic space, and based on them, the requirements, you evaluate the risk, and then you build up the test cases. So let's jump back. Now on the left side, we have risk evaluation, and which is finally its transaction, it's the damage and the probability of the damage. The damage is clear, so this is the business, it's the revenue sometimes, it's the EBITDA, it can be client effect. The transactions are usually an indication for the probability. High transaction are an indicator for higher probability of a damage. Of course, in reality, it's not always one-to-one. There are different other factors needs to be considered, but today, for an explanation, quick go into this. And then we stopped here. We said step one is to provide risk-based breakdown structure. So we solve one of an existing breakdown structures. Meanwhile, there are good existing industry models out of different industries, banking, insurance, automotive. You can reuse them because they give you a clear indication how the breakdown structure finally works. And then we add to the risk-based test case allocation, define the test case portfolio, and then it's permanently optimizing it with a method-based approach. So here on the left side, we define actually how many test cases we need to have in principle, top down or on a low level directly in an agile team or in a project. And on the right side, it's now the question how we do build up the test cases. There are different ways to go for it. It can be experience-based, different approaches. Let's go straight to one approach we recommend. It's coming out of the equivalence class analysis part or corner. And here it is an approach which is linear expansion. So finally, based on that approach, we define the main test cases and the variances in a different way. That finally we have no duplicates and no test cases which are for nothing. So all the test cases are actually pretty clear defined, following a certain structure. They are method-based, and you can actually follow them on a decision table, how many test cases actually have built it up and what kind of risk is covered. So if you speak now about coverage, it's always a risk-based coverage. It's not a real coverage. It's also the recognized risk-based coverage and not the overall. Also, that needs to be clear, but it gives you a clear indication, and that's the whole story about it, that you do it focused on the real risk. So on the left side, we focus on the risk, and on the right side, we give the answer how to go for these risks and to avoid them. It's a so-called Tosca method. You see also there in test case design a similar method, but what is missing there is the approach, how this needs to be embedded in projects into an existing world, what we have here in the middle. Without the industry model or with the overall view on these things, it's very difficult to build up here a sensible, smart testing approach. Okay, so far? Good. Now, based on that, always when we have to, for example, reduce the test cases, we start finally on the left side that we build up risk-based breakdown structure if there's a need for it. Then we analyze the test cases with respect to redundant test cases, effective test cases following a target, efficient test cases, and risk coverage. I'll jump. Here, you see a real example of a client. So what we did there is we took over the 14,000 test cases. And we did now nothing else than, and it's not magic, and that's to be recommended. Finally, the session today is also what you could optimize. Take your portfolios, analyze them, analyze them with a neutral perspective on it, and find out what is the risk behind what I'm doing. Is it real a risk? Is it maybe a low risk? That differs the way how you need to go for testing, how much test cases you expect, take decisions on that, find out if you have redundant test cases, especially in agile worlds where we have long time teams or the working teams there for a long time, then you see each sprint they add some test cases to it, and that leads meanwhile in a number of organizations to an enormous amount of test cases. And here find out what is redundant and not. It is absolutely clueless to execute redundant test cases. Or also on the effectivity side, we have seen if you have thousands of test cases, many of them are actually not even executed. Of the 40,000 test cases, it was easy to find out that some of them have never been executed in the last 12 months, 24 months. Throw them out. If you don't execute them, there is no need for having them, especially if you have an automated test suite and you keep maintenance on it and you want to keep them alive, but finally you're not executing them. Or if they're permanently going on red and you're not changing them, have a look on it, if it's needed or not, or efficiency. So have a clear view what kind of tests you have and what kind of level of tests and how you can optimize this. Again, a clear example. It's, and also that shall motivate you to go into this. Look here. We started with the 13,663 test cases. And we could reduce the test cases just by having a look into duplicates, those who are old, not executed any further, those without clear targets. We could really fast reduce test cases. We came down within 3 months by 3,000 test cases. And this is for me an excellent result. Of course, later on the real work starts. Then you need to have the industry model in place. Then you need to consider the risk of the system. Then you need to understand the methodology. You need to go into it. You need to build up the structure. Based on a structure, you actually work out what test cases are really needed. And it is nitty-gritty work. You need to go into the details. That means finally you need to understand the test cases and you need to understand the business. If that's not there, then it's fairly difficult actually to go into the details. So let's go back. So finally, there is a method-based approach, and we see it also based on results, that it starts always with the question, what's the risk? Evaluate risk, and if it's an overall approach, go into the overall structure, break it down step by step. Now on application base, agile mode base, project base, you go into the risk-based evaluation of the test cases, define where are the risks, and then optimize the test cases via such an approach where you finally say, I go in it with a method. There are also other methods to go in it, but the linear expansion is one of the methods that helps you tremendous to have a high coverage on one hand, but on the other hand, to have low or to work with a small number of test cases. If you have equivalence class analysis and the permutation, then it ends up in an enormous amount of test cases, which is not to be recommended. Search an approach, or also pairwise testing, search an approach where you can minimize the number of test cases. If it's experience-based, experience is not bad, so experience needs to be combined with a method. But experience-based test cases intend actually that we have test case portfolios where you had some issues some days before, or you have a personal passion in it, or you have a deeper understanding into it. Okay? And here we see actually how we can save money. So finally, this is also based on real examples. We see a number of test cases. You see here 500. With the linear expansion, we could tremendously actually increase the coverage rate. You see it green versus experience-based test case design approach. Or in other words, if I want to have a 50 or let's go here to 75% coverage rate, you see you need much less test cases than an experience-based test case design approach. Okay? So budget and now also combination of test case portfolio is nothing that is just a one-time fly. So finally, we see here a client example where we could save 45% of the test costs, real test costs. You know, it is something where you need to build up a plan over time. Say, how do I start? And how do I go forward to have a plan? Now, in these days, having an overall plan is difficult, as in the agile mode, there are other criteria sometimes much more important than an overall plan. But let's assume you have a chance to build up an overall plan, understand what is the actual situation, and you cannot change things just overnight. So also here, if you want to change and go into a method-based and risk-based approach, this is a step-by-step approach. And what's the message here? The message here is not that we are so brilliant. The message here is that it took us time, and it takes time also on the client side to improve these things. Here was the starting point, 19. 20, we established the methodology, where here we started end of 19. 20, we started and improved. Here we could say first time 1,500 test cases down to 3,500. Also here without quality implications. Then it is here with other things where step by step we improved. So I would like to motivate you, if you go out of that, consider actually your test case portfolio, but be clear, this is a step-by-step approach. I'll jump now quickly down to a slide. This is how we usually recommend to start. Oh, here we see some German words in it. You know, usually you start with a firefighting mode and understand the actual situation. And then it is about setting up the methodology, risk-based testing, start training the teams. It is important in these days if you have an agile team in place or agile teams in place that you actually not just consider those who are close to testing, that you consider all. That means finally give them an understanding how it works, method-based, work with them if you have a chance to, if you are responsible for testing, or ask somebody who has the insights to do this and start with a risk-based approach. Go into the teams, show them how to do it, help them, coach them, train them, make it yourself, build up a pilot, and then show it to the organization that it works. So what's the message behind it? Again, compared to the slide we saw before, it is a step-by-step approach. It is not an approach where we start on a zero basis and then overnight you have it. So there is a time we need to give the organization to change into it. And we need also to see those who are close to testing, product owners, sometimes developers, testers, business experts, they are not always just fan of the whole story here. They need to have time to understand it, to come into it. So it's a change as well. It is not just having a method on paper and then throw it on the table and say, guys, have fun on it. So we need to do it and improve it. This is also a real client example. And then we did it roll out. So we had here a start, finally, a very poor start. When we did this, we had about 85 test cases and needed to build up 1,000. And the teams were not seeing where they have to build up the test cases. It's important. That's what we did. We came in with a coaching approach. So we helped them in the beginning, and then step by step, we improved it together with them. And together with the teams is the magic word. Now it's a little bit depending on your role. But the message here is it takes time, it needs to be coached, it needs to be supported, and then there's a chance that it starts living. Now they have taken it over, and after they have taken it over, but also after a certain time, it has already started to disappear. So one thing is also absolutely clear. When you start doing this, a method-based approach, a risk-based approach, which is a necessary evil, is always to establish a clear reporting. Otherwise, you see after a certain time that things start to disappear. So this is a client example where we had the linear expansion in place. Finally, we broke down the different functionalities, built up decision tables, and based on that, we built up the test cases. This is a typical test case portfolio where you have a kind of maturity behind it. We see here a manual regression portfolio. We see here life insurance, non-life. You see the risk part, which is covered. You see here the number of test cases and the number of person days you need to consider if you want to execute them all. So concrete example, in the non-life area, we had 597 test cases. This was in the beginning. We had 57 person days to consider with an approximate coverage of 37% of the functionality. So then the business could choose how much risk they would like to take. If they want to go for 80% of the coverage, that means finally they end up here with 30. There are 297 test cases and finally 29 days of effort. So that's the clear implication on a running system you work on, that you consider how much test cases I have, what kind of risk I cover, and how much effort I have behind it. And that's finally the message of budget-oriented test case portfolio management, as a clear example. So be brave, go back, and that's my message. Consider what kind of test cases you have, what's your portfolio, can you optimize it? Or if you have more a greenfield approach in the beginning, how you can actually start from the very beginning on to have a risk-based approach, establish a methodology, bring this into the team, into the agile teams, and step by step it goes up, of course, then depending on the stages. It's not just for the agile teams, it's for all kind of testing activities. And then you see there is a strong impact, direct impact on the testing effort. Now I guess I'm running out of my time. Questions?
No, it's actually, you're good. You're right in time, actually.
Oh,
Right on time. Okay, thank you for your presentation. We saw actually that we have two first questions that so we can start answering them. And then for all the participants, if you have more questions, don't hesitate to ask them on the Q&A section of Zoom. Or if it's quite difficult, as Marie explained at the beginning, try the chat, which is available, and we can have access to all of them. So I'll start, and then Marie, as you wish, you can jump in when you want. So we have a first question from Amir. Amir previously worked on a similar project where he focused on optimizing tests by measuring code coverage. So the question of Amir is, Reto, do you have any experience or suggestions on how to effectively integrate code coverage data into a risk-based testing approach to further optimize the test cases?
code coverage follows a little bit a different approach to what we see here. This is much more on the functional side. If you go back to the code coverage, what needs to be considered is here. The recommendation is if you consider code coverage, you need to evaluate the risk of a system. Sometimes you have, I don't think we don't see the mouse. Let me quick see. Laser pointer. Sorry. So if you have here the systems, my recommendation is based on the risk of a system or a project, evaluate how much effort you want to spend into it. Code coverage is necessary level, of course, also of the overall risks, because finally in the code, the way how you program, you see later on maintenance, architecture implications, and so on. So we usually don't have this directly integrated into this, But we had in similar cases a breakdown of the risk, and based on that, we defined where to go for code analysis and where not. And we actually established then this in a kind of systematic into the organization as a procedure, a requirement for projects, for HR teams, where they have a need for code coverage, a code analysis. Okay. I don't hear you.
Sorry, it's better with the sound. Does it answer your question, Amir? You can click on the thumbs up if that's so. And while Amin is doing it, we can jump with the second question.
And Anya, if there's a need for this, send an email, then we can speak about this offline, or I can give there some further concrete ideas how to go for it. Yes, sorry for this. Micheline, your turn.
No
please.
problem. So the second question is, we have an answer from Anya. Okay, perfect. The second question is related to linear queue. You presented this approach. So Hortense has a question on this subject. On what context could it be also implemented? Because here you presented linear queue on a cost-saving approach. What other challenges can this approach help solving?
Well, finally, the whole approach is nothing else when we go back to the starting point here. An idea how I can optimize from the very early beginning on the testing. You can either do testing more wild, experience-based, by say, well, I have teams and they know how to do it. I have the epics, and based on the epics, I define acceptance criteria and I have a test case behind it. And then I see everything is fine. This is also an approach. Here, the method-based and linear group-based approach goes more in a direction that I consider from the early beginning on. I'll give the teams a kind of approach to the hand, how to get to the right test cases. And right test cases means those who consider the right risks and cover the risks, and not just test cases. And that's the methodology about. What we see here is nothing else than maybe a little bit abusing the methodology to save costs. But it is also, if you have a beginning of a project, it's much more about launching a testing and establishing a testing here. If we share this wonderful page, you see lots of text on it. But if you have, for example, like here in a concrete example, it's also a client example, where we established testing. We started here on the feature teams. We gave them a clear idea how to build up testing. So we built up a policy. We wrote down how to build up testing, what is definition of done, that the sprint is not achieving definition of done if a functionality is there. If the definition of done is then given if the test cases are defined in a method-based approach, if the test cases are documented in a system which is given, and then ideally also executed and on green. So that's the way how we go for it. So this is the lowest end, and then you have overall tests, which are overall over the feature teams, and then finally we have the process-oriented final test cases. So here it helps. Hortense, could I help you with my answer?
Okay, so you can either answer or just use the thumbs up. Okay, perfect. Thank you. I don't see other questions on the Q&A. I'm checking quickly. No, on the chat. Before we close the session, does the rest of the participants have questions that they want to ask based on what was presented, or project or something that you saw during your project? Anything that can Reto help you with? We'll see.
If there's an interest, we can go on the next level and actually make some clear examples how linear expansion works and show it up directly how to go for it if there's an interest on it.
Yeah.
Just back to Micheline and she will collect and then we can
Yeah,
consider the next session.
that could be the next session. Well, thank you all. We won't take much more of your time. Thank you for participating, for listening to Reto explaining also his approach. If you have any question, you can reach us. Definitely, you have access to our email address, if I'm not mistaken. You have access to our email address. And if you have any specific question, don't hesitate to ask us. We can definitely send them to Reto so that he can come back with a detailed answer for you. So thank you very much, and I wish you a nice day.
Thank you all.